Hi there. Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to have you joining us today for this public webinar and launch of our final report on content moderation in the Global South. My name is DeVan Hankerson Madrigal, and I'm the research manager at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Um, I'll leave it to my colleague to give more explanation and introduction to the project, but suffice it to say, we are really thrilled to have you here. A few housekeeping notes as we get started. As you know, this event will be live streamed and it will be recorded. There is also a captioner, so if you can make yourself available of captioning, that service is available. You'll see that we've included some notes in the chat on how you can access the various interpretations in Arabic, Spanish, and Swahili. Lastly, we'll ask that you use the Q&A button to submit questions. Our Q&A for the event will be at the end of the event, and we'll do our best to address all of the questions. We encourage you to submit questions in Arabic, Swahili, Spanish, or English. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to CDT Research Director, Dhanaraj Thakur, to say more about the Global South Content Moderation Project.
Great. Thank you so much, Dylan, and welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. I'm going to give a brief introduction to our project. I'm going to share my screen if that's okay. I have a few slides I'll quickly run through. Can you all see this fine? Yeah, can you see my slides? Good. Great. So, just a quick note on the Center for Democracy and Technology. We are a nonprofit tech policy organization based in Washington, D.C. and also in Brussels. We focus primarily on advocacy around civil and human rights in digital spaces. And that touches on many different topics, including privacy, free expression, security and surveillance, and so on. This project is something we started almost 2 years now with support from the Internet Society Foundation. It essentially asks questions around about content moderation systems and how these kinds of systems work in what's called low resource languages. In other words, languages for which there's little data available online to train various kinds of machine learning models. How do those systems work in low resource languages and and indigenous languages as well around in the majority world? That is a question that we started off with this project. The background around this is a recognition of a few things. One is that a lot of the research that we see around content moderation on social media systems focus on the US, North America, and EU. So those are the kinds of contexts where you see a lot of research as well as a lot of focus among social media platforms themselves when it comes to content moderation. And by here, by systems, I don't mean just the analysis of an individual piece of user-generated content. I mean the system as a whole. So how do these platforms assess an individual piece of content? How do they handle appeals? How do they handle user reporting about content or enforcement of rules around their content moderation policies? Another issue that we have also recognized and that many other researchers recognize is the question of how these platforms design and implement content moderation policies, particularly policies when it comes to languages in the majority world, including low resource and indigenous languages. So when we think of policies, we think of like considerations about trade-offs between allowing certain kinds of speech or forms of speech around a given topic, or not allowing certain kinds of speech, and various kinds of interventions that you'd see with content policies on platforms. How are those policies designed and implemented for these contexts? Another aspect of the issue of the problem that we also observed and that other researchers have pointed out to is the incorporation of emerging kinds of AI tools in content moderation systems. In other research CDT has done, we have pointed out some of the potential risks and areas for improvement in the application of, for example, large language models to content moderation systems, particularly the use of what's called multilingual large language models. The application of these technologies introduce risks, potential harms, and in or disproportionate forms of moderation in these languages. So the question here is, how does this actually work? And this is something we wanted to explore. So to explore these questions, we decided to look at a project based on several case studies, looking at different low resource languages and indigenous languages around the world. Obviously, there are many different languages we could have explored and examined, but this is given the limited resources they had and how we want, and the reason, the motivation for us to go in depth in some of these languages, we focused on these four in consultation with partners around the world as well. So the first one is Maghrebi Arabic, which is spoken in North Africa. And you can note from this table that even though I'm referring to these as, quote, low resource languages, they are in fact spoken by tens of millions or even more people in their respective regions. These are languages with very significant speaking populations. Okay. The other point to note, the other languages we have Kiswahili in East Africa, East and Central Africa, Tamil in South Asia, Quechua in South America. Quechua being one of the indigenous languages that we introduced into our study. So you're going to hear more from my colleague, Dr. Elswah, more on the results that we and the analysis that we encountered in this. The last point I want to make before just stopping and then moving on to the other speakers is the importance of this. We understand, I think we all recognize the importance of social media in our everyday lives, and therefore the importance of having efficient, effective, and just content moderation when it comes to our use of those platforms. This has impacts in terms of our economic, financial impacts, and how people use these platforms. There is free speech implications. There are implications for abuse, online violence, political expression, and many more. So to encapsulate a lot of what I just mentioned, I'll end with a quote from one of the people we interviewed in the study, specifically someone from Peru. They say here, quote, "When we post in Quechua, it limits our reach. Language should not be a barrier. I wish for the algorithms to treat all the languages the same so that we can have the same opportunities." Great. So I'm going to stop here and hand it back to you, DeVan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dhanaraj. Can someone in the chat said they couldn't see the presentation. I think we're okay on the presentation. Please send any issues that you might have to the Q&A for us to help you troubleshoot if you're having issues with the interpretation or the presentation. Thank you. Moving on, we'll now hear from Mona Elswah, project lead for the Global South study, and Mona will be discussing the main findings from this research. Mona, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you for the summary.
Hey, thank you, DeVan. Thank you, Dhanaraj, as well for the introduction. I'm gonna share my presentation. Just give me a second. I hope everyone will be able to see it. Okay, let me. Okay, okay. I'm gonna. Okay. Okay. Again, thanks so much for attending today's webinar. We are here celebrating the end of the project of 18-month investigating content moderation in the majority world. And in my today's presentation, I'm going to try to give you some highlights of the findings of the report, of the last output of the project, the comparative report, as we call it. Please go ahead and read it because my presentation will not be able to cover everything due to the limited time. First of all, as Dhanaraj mentioned, content moderation is not just simply, removing content or allowing content. It is a complex process that involves different stages. For example, a platform will have to think of the definition, how to define what is permissible or not, how to detect content, how to evaluate it, how to enforce policies, how users could appeal, and how to educate them about their policies. Again, it is a complicated, long process that companies really think of how to implement them. However, content moderation, unfortunately, is sometimes inconsistent and biased in the majority world, specifically for low resource languages. As Dhanaraj mentioned quickly, what are low resource languages? Low resource languages, we define them as languages that have limited high quality text data available. They are languages that are less studied and less computerized. They are not languages that, I don't want you to think of them as languages spoken by smaller populations, but rather they are languages that could be spoken by hundreds of millions of people. However, they are less computerized. They have less visibility online compared to English and other Western languages. And as Dhanaraj mentioned, we had many questions in the 18 months of investigating content moderation. And content moderation, if there's one thing you should know about it, it is challenging to study. It is super challenging to study due to the secrecy culture in this field and how companies are keeping, how they enforce policies and their policies and design them and all the aspects of it, hidden for so many reasons. And also of the black box of the algorithms and everything. Again, it is not an easy subject to study, but we wanted to be able to study it somehow. So we thought of different methods. First, we thought of doing surveys with frequent online social media users. We interviewed content moderators, digital rights advocates, tech company representatives in the different 4 regions that Dhanaraj mentioned. We also did some focus group sessions in some cases, and we did roundtable discussions with NLP researchers and other experts as well. Again, some highlights from the findings. What really stood out in the survey is that there is about 41% of the overall survey participants across the 4 regions indeed say that there is restriction, they have experienced some restrictions or content removal somehow. Across the 4 cases, survey respondents reported the highest rate of content removal in the Tamil case, and we can talk about this, of course, more in details later. Also, there is, of course, an obvious distrust of social media platforms, specifically those social media platforms based in the US. Particularly, this was very obvious with the Maghrebi Arabic case, of course, related to the Gaza war and the other many incidents of shadow banning and content removal taking place while we were conducting this survey. Another thing I wanted you to, discuss with you all today is also when you think of content moderation, companies think of it differently. Companies, they serve users across the world, and how they want to enforce policies, they think they do it differently. And we try to categorize the ways they enforce policies into 2 main categories, global and local. The first thing is global. Global is, when a tech company want to enforce one policy on all users worldwide, no exception except for very, very tiny exceptions. That is, the way content moderation was, primarily enforced. And of course, they thought of this because it's easier to enforce. Content moderators do not have to really remember many policies and many variations in policies. And also, it is a way to prevent external interventions from governments, from, any external actor that want to intervene in policies by telling them, no, it's just a global policy. However, that led to, the exclusion of many linguistic and cultural variations. And that is definitely a reason why we have so many content moderation errors, is because of that, or at least one of the reasons. The other option would be the local one, or the second category of main category of content moderation approaches is the local one. So some companies try to like, okay, we're going to tailor some policies to meet the or to fit the culture of some regions or group of countries together. And tailoring some policies, like specifically cultural related policies, like, those related to nudity, violence, animal cruelty, and other, cultural elements. It is indeed more sensitive to cultural and linguistic variations. However, it's harder for moderators to remember all these variations. It confuses them in multiple incidents. And also, it at some point could prevent users who want to challenge local norms into doing so, while localizing some policies, might be preventing some users from challenging local norms. There's another approach that, is different, but again, I'm going to keep it for maybe the Q&A or something, due to the limited time. The other third most important finding we had is also the way the enforcement of the policies is done either manually or through automation. In the manual part of content moderation, which here comes the word moderators, they work at vendors, and the moderators we spoke with, when we spoke to more than 20 moderators across the 4 regions, and the majority, if not all, are suffering from some sort of PTSD, some sort of trauma, and it's really, really hard job. And we can see that they have been exploited and overworked and underpaid. Additionally, the culture of secrecy for the content moderators have to live in and to have to hide their identity and their job and everything is also adding to this exploitation. One moderator in Tunisia told me that it affected me and my mental health badly. Even psychologists didn't help. I reached the level that I had to take medication so I could get some sleep. It was that bad. It affects the way you think as well. You see people in another way. That is a quote from a Tunisian content moderator who is suffering from PTSD due to the work he did in content moderation. And of course, I don't want to just you to think of this as, it is a bad part of the job. It also influences moderation. Imagine if you have bad work environment like this, how come you're going to do good decisions, good reviewing of moderation? And eventually these decisions that moderators make also feeds models and train data. And again, it messes up the entire process of content moderation. The other part, which is the automated content moderation part, when we talk about low resource languages, we already talk about languages that have low availability of training data. And that indeed impacts the quality of the models that is needed to do automated content moderation. But also no languages in general are evolving, and they have many variations. Low resource languages, they do have evolution and variations, of course, due to colonialism as well. You would see that, Arabizi, for example, in the Arab world, or Shing, in case of Kenya, like it is really, it changes quickly and models need to keep up with that. And what we currently have, we're so behind when it comes to keeping up with that, with these changes. The good news is that, and this is what I want to end my findings with, is that users are resisting to content moderation bias, to algorithmic bias, and not just that, but also to the bad communication channels between users and tech companies. So, for example, these are some of the tactics that we found that users employ to overcome that. For example, mass reporting is something that users created, to call their friends and family to take down a specific page or an account that, they couldn't take down using the normal reporting mechanism. Algospeak, the word that we have been hearing, is also an effect of their perception of being, marginalized by the algorithm. Also, civil society intervention is now a main thing when it comes to about the communication between users and tech companies. And of course, it's a burden on many civil society organizations. And also, I want to add that as we said, we spoke to many NLP researchers, and we found that in the regions we studied, and I'm sure in other regions as well, NLP researchers, they have amazing methods and tools and tactics in order to collect data, to build data sets for their languages and dialects. They already have the knowledge and the tools and the mechanism to overcome the lack of data availability, the data access, and issues like that. Again, they are resisting in their own way. Based on that, I'm going to leave you with 4 main recommendations. We need to disclose more to users about when, why, and how moderation occurs, and we need to learn more from civil society and user feedback. We need to ensure the adoption of linguistic and cultural expertise in all parts of the development and implementation of content moderation policies and processes. We need to have better working conditions for content moderators, and this needs to change, I hope, sooner than later. Lastly, we need to reshape the current content moderation approaches, because currently the ones we have pros and cons, and we need to think of it differently. Thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions. DeVan, back to you.
Thank you so much, Mona. Just a reminder that there is live interpretation for this event. If you joined late, there are instructions about how to access that interpretation in the chat. And please also ask your questions throughout the event. You don't need to hold them to the end. Just please access the Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom window. And we encourage you to ask questions in Arabic, Swahili, or Spanish. And we'll be getting to them later, but add them as we go along, please, so that you don't need to hold them. Well, thank you again, Mona. And in this next section, we'll be discussing each case study in turn, starting with the Maghrebi Arabic case study. I'll be turning it back over to Mona and Emna Mizouni, founder and CEO of Digital Citizenship and our partner for the Maghrebi Arabic case study. Turning it over to you, Mona. Thanks.
Thanks, DeVan, again. Emna, hi, and I'm so excited you're here, and I'm so eager to ask you a couple of questions for the Maghrebi Arabic case. We worked on it together with Digital Citizenship. So the first question is, how do you see the future of Arabic content moderation in general and Maghrebi Arabic in particular? And I hope that you see it in a positive way.
Hi, thank you for having me. And I'll start by saying it was amazing to work on something like this that is so close to my heart personally and close to our mandate as Digital Citizenship. So we're so grateful that we were part of it. The future, I don't know. Is that good? Is that positive enough? I think the future of Arabic and the Maghrebi content, it hinges on addressing the current issues that you just presented, Mona. The continuous work with distrust or the limited resources in terms of content moderators, sorry, and that burden that comes on the human side, they are not positive, and we don't think there is a huge a change or any responsiveness from the tech platforms. So it really hurts to see people that suffer a lot from the content that we produce. And here I don't speak only as Digital Citizenship, but I speak also on behalf of the users of internet in the Maghreb region. And so if we see it from the user perspective, we are not happy. If we see it from the content moderators that we're frustrated with most of the time, they work under harsh conditions. And I don't think this is changing in a very corporate world. And let's not forget that the tech companies are actually corporate. They are not, whether they like it or not, they do not allow a lot of human rights within their space. It's really corporate driven. And we've seen that a lot when, for example, the Meta CEO testified in Congress, for example. He kept saying multiple times that's the business model and that's how it works. It's a business for them. And so going back to the human moderators, I think there is a lot demanded from them by the company and by the users. And in the same time, we're losing the human aspect. So that's not going to change. There is a huge lack of transparency from the tech companies, and that's working for them so far. They are not being banned from any of the countries that we're talking about in the global majority, let alone the Maghrebi context. And so it's really, it's not a bright future, to not say it's dire. And I'm not very optimistic when it comes to the new era of the agentic AI that's going to basically kill the human content moderators' jobs. We will have to work with agents. We're always bothered by and frustrated by the work of the machines, the automation, and the AI involvement in content moderation. It will be worse with the agents. And I know they are moving towards having agents everywhere. So agents, they do lack of cultural sensitivities, they do lack of language. And like you said, the tactics might work, for example, when you use different combinations, but they will not understand it. Even if they do, it's not a priority. And so the moderation will not be better, unfortunately.
It is indeed unfortunate, but what do you think is our role as researchers, users, civil society here, in general, but particularly with in the Maghreb region?
We have a major role. So we talked about the burden on the human content moderators. There is also a burden and a lot that is asked from the civil society, researchers like yourself, international organizations, and international policymakers or internet policymakers. I think we have a lot to do in terms of global majority. We need to gather our effort. We need to come together and work. In our togetherness, we can fight these giant tech companies. I think that's the only way. We could go on global calls and show globally, again, as a global majority, show how they are treating us. They have no respect for our countries. And when we talk about our countries, the Maghreb countries that were selected for this research, they're about 100 million users, 50 in Algeria, sorry, not users, but 100 million citizens, 50 million in Algeria, 40 in Morocco, almost 12 in Tunisia, with a high rate of connectivity of use of those platforms. We also have a huge ads revenue that comes from the MENA region. So we have an economic power that we're not using. And so there was an estimation of, I think, above 20% of growth rate in terms of ads revenue that the MENA region provides for these tech companies. Of course, there is no transparency, again, in the data that comes out of it, but a rough calculation using their ads library and other techniques, you can know how much we're spending. The GCC alone, for example, spent about $17 billion in ads last year, maybe about 6 to 7 billion in the Maghreb region. That's a huge amount. Those are rough estimations. If we can use those estimations and use people who are investing and using those services to let them know about the other negative aspects of using the platforms, and how even them who are using the ads are being subject to content moderation and content removal in some cases. And so, yeah, we have some power that we can use if we think collectively.
I totally agree. I have one last question. So you talked a little bit about the responsiveness of tech companies to civil society. Can you talk us through like the process and how difficult or easy this process, and what should, tech companies, I hope if anyone is listening, like do better with users in the Maghreb region, in your opinion?
That's a loaded question. Those tech companies, they have offices in our region, and they have representation and team members who speak our language. Good people, I do not doubt that. But in terms of responsiveness, it's up and down. It's never continuous responsiveness. The communication and exchange with them is so fragile. We have one of our programs, our services is a helpline, and we try to support people from the Maghreb region, and particularly Tunisia, to help with content moderation cases where they have issues. And the responsiveness is so low. Even with the automation of their services, it's still low. There is something in the culture, they cannot get it. Or their policy is different. And here they would use the ticket of, this is our global policy. This is our policy. But it's a policy that is debated even in their home countries. Take, for example, Meta. Their policy is debated. They do not apply the same policy for the European Union, for example, or Germany, like they apply it in the MENA region and in the Maghreb countries. And so there is really a big issue here in terms of communication with them. They're not responsive, generally speaking. And the inquiries they respond to is usually a low rate. And this is not only for digital citizenship. I know that from a fact, working with other organizations and entities across the Maghreb and the MENA region, there is always an issue. It's a very political region. We're always having debates and having new things happening, like wars and attacks and this and that, and dictatorships. All of that really has all of that political side has its load on their responsiveness. Sometimes I have the feeling that they just don't want to respond to us because we are Tunisian, and it's not the best or the favorite ally for them right now, or because we are taking a case from Morocco, for example, and they don't want to get in trouble, things like that. So yeah, I hope that they get better in responsiveness.
Thank you so much, Amna, and I definitely hope that too. Thank you so much again for working with us in the Maghrebi Arabic case. DeVan, back to you.
Thanks again. That was really interesting. And thank you again, Emna, for your work with us on this. Now we'll turn to the next segment, and we'll be hearing from Aliya Bhatia, CDT's Senior Policy Analyst for the Free Expression Project and co-lead for the Tamil case, along with Amrita Sengupta, BRICS Fellow and our partner for the Tamil case. They'll be discussing the findings from that case. Aliya, Amrita?
Thanks, DeVan, and great to be in conversation with Amrita. The Tamil case study was obviously close to my heart as someone interested in this larger question of how do we improve moderation, but also in focusing on a region that I really wanted to focus on and I come from. So Amrita, you and your team were incredibly helpful in sort of helping shape the sort of frame of inquiry and also helping us talk to survey over 140 users who use social media frequently in Tamil across two regions, India and Sri Lanka. As part of the study, we also interviewed 17 content creators, journalists, content moderators, NLP experts, and trust and safety policy professionals. So those sort of professionals working within the tech companies tasked with enforcing policies or shaping policies pertaining to the South Asia region or APAC region, whatever they wanted to call it. And I think this was a unique case study in the four that we studied because of number one, the script. It was a non-Latin script. Tamil is communicated using the Abugida script, but also what we found was that due to just the unavailability or lack of familiarity with keyboards or hardware, a lot of users were using sort of the Latin script or Romanized transliteration of Tamil online, which necessarily complicates what Mona was talking about, which is sort of the digitization of a language to create automated tools. Tamil is also diglossic, which means that the way it's spoken and written is very different. Although social media exists in this like middle ground where people are using are transcribing a spoken or more colloquial form of communication. So it sort of exists in this middle ground with not the same well-defined rules. And then also there isn't just one Tamil beyond just spoken and written. Tamil is a very diverse language across different regions. Some of the people we interviewed said, I can't I'm from this part of Sri Lanka, and if I spoke to someone from another part or across the country, they would be speaking a totally different Tamil, let alone the Tamil that's spoken in Tamil Nadu or Andhra Pradesh. Different parts of the country or the region speak different types of Tamil, and it's very much influenced by neighboring languages as well. So to kick us off to the conversation part, I really, want this to be a conversation. One thing I'll just start off by saying is, so the first question I'll ask is pertaining to what Mona was talking about companies sort of saying that they have using one of two major approaches, either the global approach of developing a uniform set of policies and applying them across the region or across the regions in which their users are based and across the languages that they're using, or a sort of localized approach where they say, okay, our user base is in this region or speaking this language, and these are the norms and linguistic nuances that need to be considered. One example that came out in the Indian or South Asian context is that one platform we spoke with said that, in Hindi, they would tolerate remarks denigrating Periyar, a big philosophical sort of figure in the region. Whereas in Tamil, when users were speaking Tamil, they would scrutinize more when people were speaking about Periyar and specifically criticizing him just because of sort of the Southern Indian perception or sort of deification of Periyar. So there was this unique cultural context that was at play when enforcing these rules. And Amrita, something we've talked a lot about is that both the global and local approach and content moderation broadly has trade-offs. There's no sort of one-size-fits-all approach. So can we talk a little bit more about, what are the sort of trade-offs or considerations that come into play with the localized content moderation approach? Is it just that let's just, localize and every language and every community should choose their own policies?
Great. Thanks so much, Aliya. And thank you also for that introduction to the language and the sort of complexities that exist in the way the language is used and spoken. And to just kind of add to that and how that complicates content moderation is that, not only does content moderation require a strategy which is actually extending beyond simple Boolean logic, which is something that Mona was referring to, but it actually requires a much more multi-layered approach that accounts for these very sort of specific linguistic and cultural complexities. And you spoke about Tamil, but more broadly in the Indian context, the inability to often detect coded language whether it is gendered, religious, caste-based hate speech, and the use of more than 19,500 mother tongues within India's 121 regional languages actually adds to this very complexity that you are talking about, where many moderators may lack training in recognizing some of the coded threats and the dynamics of this sort of like intersectional kind of harms that may emerge from harmful content online. But at the same time, there's also the dual issue that has been referred to earlier as well, right? Of over-moderation of speech in some instances, while harmful content, specifically when targeted to marginalized communities, continues to exist on these platforms. So I want to point to a couple of sort of research work that colleagues have done at CIS and otherwise, which points to these very specific cases. And I want to point to one work by my former colleague Yatharth, who's looked at Bahujan publishing infrastructure, where we heard that one of the respondents actually said that Meta and Twitter exhibit double standards when it comes to content moderation between the West and India. So talking to this sort of localized versus global approach, where in the West, they may have zero tolerance for some sort of, let's say, white supremacist content. But in Indian context, when, let's say, content from Brahmin supremacists actually spread casteist hate speech, that is actually allowed to exist on the platforms. And again, the automated content moderation itself often fails to detect such hate speech, especially when it's coded in, different languages, where the tactics of the language and the terms and sort of slangs that are used often evolve with time. And, on the platforms, people find different ways to use this coded language. So whether or not, global versus local, there are definitive trade-offs. The way that I like to think about it is that, can we separate the principles of what do we follow for content moderation with the actual practice, in the sense that you follow certain global or standard international principles that do not sort of, legitimize, co-opting from authoritarian actors, for example, which are rooted in international humanitarian law, where the principles stand while contextualized to local instances, where you actually think about, like, okay, if there is casteist hate speech, how do we moderate for that? Or gendered hate speech, how do we moderate for that in different languages while keeping certain principles, fundamental principles in place? So that's one way that, one can think about global versus local content. The other, of course, is that, we're still talking about global platforms. In India, there was also a study that colleagues did on looking at local video platforms to say whether local platforms is a response to the problems of content moderation on global platforms. However, and this was specifically rooted in questions of gender-based violence. And what was found in that study by colleagues DeVan and Lakshmi was that the guidelines of the platforms in the study demonstrated very minimal recognition of the gendered effects of potential behaviors related to OGBV. And in fact, none of the platforms had a separate policy or section dedicated to OGBV, which really says that localization or local platforms may not necessarily always be the sort of response to this problem of global content moderation as well. And I think the report, like CDT's report as well, talks about this, that, while we acknowledge the cultural differences, it is important that moderation policies are tailored to fit within contexts which still promote speech, let's say, about LGBTQ plus issues. And we know that, platforms now are increasingly moving to this idea of absolute, free speech. We've seen content moderation policy changes on Meta's platforms, which is now being applied in the US specifically. But how will that impact particular marginalized identities, and how that will also have an impact on languages when that is, transported to, hate speech in different languages where protection for marginalized identities may not exist. So I'll pause there.
No, that's really great. And I'm glad you sort of highlighted those two reports as well, which we'll share in the chat afterwards. But I want to pick up on this theme of like the double standard. That was something that we heard a lot when we spoke directly with, when we interviewed users, and that we didn't, this was not the term of art for the report, but like some sort of power user, right? Someone who's like more familiar with the policies. We repeatedly got told by people we interviewed, we've read the policies and we're reporting this content, this harassment we're facing. We know that it fits squarely within the remit of violative content, but it's not being removed. And those individuals were predominantly highlighting gender-based harassment or reporting caste-based harassment. So there was this like deep suspicion for the sort of like uniform or equitable application of policies. And this distrust often manifested because they felt like they were not being told why, right? They were not being given either correct or any sort of detailed responses for why content was not violative or why content was violative. One example was that this user found that every time she reported a post, it would not be taken down. But if she screenshotted the inbound comment or like the violative comment and posted the screenshot of this is what someone is saying, this using the slur, that post itself, where she was highlighting someone else's sort of harassing text, would be removed. So this feeling of like this double standard, this like just complete nonsensical sort of nature of moderation. And so that sort of lends me to my next question, which is, a large part of this report included those examples under the vein of lack of transparency and lack of transparency sort of breeding distrust or breeding conspiratorial thinking of, okay, this is actually the actor who's, pulling the strings for moderation. They don't have our back, etc. And so I guess like the large question is, in the what role can transparency play? Is transparency meaningful, and what sort of transparency would be meaningful?
Thanks, Aliya. And I think this is a question that has, this is not a new question, and civil society actors have been talking about it for a really long time. And I think it's important to reflect on like where we are right now with transparency, with corporate accountability, and I agree with Emna that maybe we are not at a very good space right now where we're moving towards increasing transparency. But if we think about transparency should have a very critical role to play when we think about how content is being moderated, how content is being taken down. Like you presented from the Tamil case study, and we've done other work as well, where there is a lot of lack of clarity on why something gets taken down versus why something is allowed to exist on the platform. And some of this is also related to business models, which Emna also pointed to. If we think about the idea of engagement-based ranking, where there are thresholds that platforms use where you allow viral content, whether or not it's harmful, to exist on the platform, as long as it doesn't cross the threshold of illegality or what very directly violates policies in a particular kind of way, which is like straight up illegal content, where that platform is both prioritized and continues to be recommended on the platform, and how that has created wide-ranging harms for marginalized communities and identities. And therefore, what could transparency look like for users? We, as people who work in this space, may think of transparency in a certain kind of way where there is transparency reporting, and companies do provide those reports, although what and how that is reported, there is much left to be desired in those reports. But for users in different languages, what could actually transparency look like? It actually comes down to the specifics of, how do I get information on what data is being collected? How is my data being used? When I report, what are the reporting mechanisms? How can we simply explain those in a way that is explainable to users across different levels of digital literacy, different levels of literacy in the different languages that people are using these platforms on? And like I like to say that informed consent in its absolute form doesn't exist. Like we've talked about informed consent and we've talked about choice on the platforms, but how much of it is user agency, choice, and consent, and how much of it is actually platforms determining many of those things where users end up complying? So how do we shift essentially this burden of responsibility from the user, where the user is made to believe often that we are making choice and we are in control of our data, when we know for a fact that that's not the case, to shift greater responsibility to platforms to say what meaningful transparency should look like? How can you simplify that language? How can you be made accountable to provide that information repeatedly, improve your processes and how you provide that information, spend resources, especially in different languages, to provide those redressal mechanisms and inputs on how content gets taken down is something that I think more and more organizations should ask for. Civil society actors, different stakeholders. An organization in India, Digital Rights and Gender Organization Point of View, is doing some work researching in like what does public accountability and transparency look like for platforms. And we'll be happy to, I mean, I'm associated with them, would be love to share more on that. But yes, do believe that it has a huge role when it is done meaningfully and actually is user-friendly.
Yeah, I like this idea of like changing the paradigm from telling users more to actually using that as a lever for expecting more from the platform. I think all of us on this call and tuning in are hyper aware of just like how much legalese is now embedded into content moderation policies that are disclosed, and how little it has become about users or friendliness or literacy. Final question, because I know we're running over time, but I want to pick up on a couple of I want to give you the last word on pulling together, if there was a future for content moderation or alternative, what would it look like? You just talked a little bit about questions that we should be asking, but if we are talking about this principles-based application, like what's something we should be doing next?
Thanks. And I know we're over time. So one is that before even we reach the stage of content moderation, what are some steps that platforms can take in terms of their design where, because content moderation in itself is a reactive response to a problem that is seen, or you take down a content or you report harmful speech, and how do you work on that? Are there ways in which the platforms can be designed such that to begin with, there's been some work on this, which was a joint project by the Search for Common Ground, Integrity Institute, and Council on Tech and Social Cohesion, which actually looks at what are some ways in which, instead of thinking content moderation first, how do we think about design that actually looks at how can we have change user behavior on the platforms, nudge users to rethink things that they may be sharing, create a platform space where it's safe to share certain content in a way that not everybody is exposed to, so to make certain design changes. And content moderation itself, I think we're at a precipice where we are trying different approaches with some platforms saying that we're going to really reduce content moderation to different, federated ways in which, for example, Mastodon is thinking about like federated ways of content moderation. I think we need to think about different approaches and really have more context-specific ways in which those approaches are actualized. And I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, and hope to talk to you very soon. Okay, over to DeVan.
Thank you so much, Amrita and Aliya. In this next segment, we'll be chatting again with Mona Elswah, our project lead, and Miriam Wanjiru, excuse me, I wasn't on camera, program officer for Paradigm Initiative. I will go ahead and turn it over to you two to talk a little bit more about our findings from the Kiswahili case study.
Thank you, DeVan. Miriam, I have so many questions for you for the Kiswahili case. First of all, let's just talk about the context of Kiswahili content moderation. If you can describe it to audience today, what is the current context surrounding content moderation in Swahili in general?
Thank you, Mona. Good day, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. First of all, I have to admit this was one of my favorite projects the past couple of months, not just because I'm a native Kiswahili speaker. I am from Nairobi, Kenya, and Kiswahili is one of the official languages here, but I also coordinate our work at Paradigm Initiative across a region that uses Kiswahili on a day-to-day, both for business and, just communicating. What is the current state of content moderation for Kiswahili language for non-Africans? Let me just begin by saying that Kiswahili is one of the many languages spoken on the continent. In Africa, there are about 2,000 languages, but Kiswahili is just one of them. And we specifically picked Kiswahili because it has quite a huge number of people who use the language. Currently, about over 100 million people in Africa communicate using Kiswahili. So by virtue of that, it is one of the languages that, and I say this loosely, has been lucky to experience a bit of content moderation practices on the continent, but we have many thousands more that have not witnessed any form of content moderation. So having said that, the state of content moderation in the continent, or rather for Kiswahili specifically, has been in a number of ways. So different platforms, that is Meta, TikTok, would ordinarily use, in the last couple of years, would ordinarily use human content moderators and mix that a little bit with automated content moderators. Now, for human content moderators, there was an assumption that every Kiswahili speaker uses the same language. However, Kiswahili has, just like we've listened to previous speakers, it has different facets and different, variations to the language. But how big tech and, technology platforms would do it is they would bring together a few individuals, specifically in Nairobi, in Kenya, to moderate content in Swahili. And this is, they would cover multiple countries. So that is Kenya, Tanzania, most East African countries, and a bit of Central Africa. So that in and of itself was problematic because not every Kiswahili speaker speaks the language the same way. There are variations therein. That's the first bit. The second bit is, while content moderators in human form would work for platforms such as Meta, they were not directly working for platforms such as Meta. So how content moderators are enrolled or how they are hired is through third party. And this was not, deployed in goodwill, if you ask me, because big tech platforms did not want to be accountable to the content moderator. So and there are multiple instances when there were problems and content moderators would say, either we are not paid well or you're not looking out for their mental health. So they would constantly be told, we did not hire you directly, so go to the third party. So that's the second manner in which content moderation was conducted, or currently still being conducted around East Africa.
Yeah, I want to add, Miriam, to yes, indeed, moderators do have to moderate content from different countries in East and Central Africa. But also in this case study, what I found very surprising, I would say, is that Kiswahili moderators not only had to moderate Swahili, but also to moderate English content other countries because they can speak English. So let's give them content from the US or Australia or Canada, context they have never been to, they're not aware of, but they also had to review. And that was definitely, adds to overworking them. And also they said that it was more traumatizing content compared to the content they had to review from, East and Central Africa. That was, also something very surprising to me that I didn't see in the Maghrebi Arabic case. Speaking of moderators, there is a lot of media coverage about the status of content moderators in Kenya specifically, and we hear of the Content Moderation Union in Africa. Can you tell us more about how can we help give voice to moderators? What is our role here? Because I interviewed those moderators, we spoke with them, but still, I want to help them, but I want to help them, get better work rights, to get better working environment. But I felt helpless. And do you have, did you think of ways to help them?
Yeah, thanks. So first of all, don't feel helpless, because what you did through this research was a step in the right direction, because you need data, you need stories documented, you need a lot of people knowing the atrocities that are currently happening. So as researchers, that's your role, and we need that information as much as possible. But there are also other avenues that we can support the situation. It can be legal, from a legal standpoint, from a policy standpoint, but then also us guys in civil society advocating for just basic human rights. And there's a lot so far that has gone into it. Currently, we have an African Union for Content Moderators. This is the first of its kind. Last I checked, there were over 150 members to the union. And this is significant because for most content moderators, as they were being employed, one of the strategies and one of the things they were told is you cannot unionize. You cannot know the next person who's doing this work. You're not allowed to form a union. You're not allowed to complain together. Once you do that, you're automatically thrown off and you're blacklisted in the industry. So that's a step in the right direction. At least we are seeing a lot more content moderators coming together from the East African region, but also at an African level. There's also been a bit of effort to go into streamlining laws and policies. I know for sure there's a bill that was proposed in Parliament to recognize content moderators as employers, right? And all gig workers as employers, so that they can unionize, they can ask for health insurance, they can demand for these things that ordinary workers would demand. So from researchers documenting, putting out the stories, journalists as well, it has been documented a lot, the grievous situations that content moderators had to work under, particularly in East Africa. So they're also really doing a fantastic job. Civil society advocating for streamlined and harmonized laws in Parliament, and that is really, really fantastic. But then also pushing for accountability from big tech platforms. There are currently 3 cases in court against Meta, and most of them are around content moderators. So which is really, really interesting, and most of them are landmark. Because I remember when it was first filed, Meta came back and said, we are not registered in your country, and so this case cannot be tried in Kenya. But then the High Court ruled and said, in fact, you can, because you have users here and you have people who are working for the company. So it's one of the cases that we are looking forward to seeing, because it will most definitely set jurisprudence, and so that at least other companies can follow suit. So there are a number of things we can do, and for sure, you're one of the people who are changing the narrative in a good way.
Thank you, Maria. You're definitely doing more work than I do about that. I want to ask you about also, like, I can see this question in the Q&A as well, like the variations in Swahili. Like when we think of the Swahili, as I'm not a Swahili speaker, but when I approach the language, I thought it's just one version of it. But obviously it has many variations. We also see the Shing as a language, the urban language or the youth language in Kenya. And how in your view, how Swahili as contextual, as many variations, impacts the content moderation for Swahili?
Right. So again, for non-Kiswahili speakers, Sheng is one of the variations. And when we were doing this research, I remember telling you that it's very youthful, urban, mostly millennials and Gen Z. Now, just to give an update, since the last time we spoke, there's also another variation called Shembeteng, which is for much, much younger people. I also cannot understand, and I'm quite, quite integrated into the space. So that definitely affects. So my response to that is that there's no one approach or one policy to moderating Kiswahili. And that's why when I see, and someone also mentioned, I worry when we are quick to move towards automated content moderation as a solution. And my response constantly is we need a mix of both. You need the human element to content moderation. I worry even more looking at how fact-checking is going, particularly in the US. And we tend to, or rather, most organizations tend to follow suit, right? So I worry, and I think for me as a solution, it would be a mix of both, just ensuring that human elements are there. Of course, we cannot deny the importance of AI and automated content moderation, but it cannot be one or the other. It has to be a mix of both, 100%. And also I remember one of the things that came out from the research is, again, which I've said, is assuming that since I'm Kenyan, Kenyan moderators can moderate content from Tanzania, for example. And remember during the research, one of the things that I was telling you is one word means something totally different in Kenya, as opposed to Tanzania. And a good example is shoga, which it can mean friend, but then it can also mean someone who identifies as gay. So context really matters, and that's why you really need human elements to content moderation.
Indeed, and the current situation, as you mentioned, like the majority, if not all, Kiswahili moderators are Kenyans. Many, very, very few of them are from Tanzania or other countries that speak Swahili, again, which adds to the column moderation errors that we see. I'm gonna have to stop and go back to DeVan, but I want to invite all our audiences today to check Jamie Forums. It's a Tanzanian platform that does, in our research, we found that it does offer an alternative moderation approach. It does hire moderators from each country that speaks Swahili. It does rely more on manual moderation rather than automation. And it's a very unique model of moderation. And during my research, I only heard good things about the way it handles Kiswahili content. So please go ahead, visit the platform, and also read our research on it. DeVan, floor is yours again. Thank you. Thank you, Miriam, so much.
Thank you so much, Mona and Miriam. Now for our final case study segment, we'll be hearing from CDT Research Director Dhanaraj Thakur, along with Dilmar Villena, who is our regional partner for the Quechua case. Dilmar, Dhanaraj?
Great. Thank you, DeVan. And Dilmar, how are you? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Generic.
Good. Great. Thank you. So, Dilmar, you're Executive Director of Hiperderecho, based in Peru. It was really good to work with you on the Quechua case study. And it's been fascinating listening to the other speakers and other partners and researchers on the project based on your experiences with the other case studies. I think one question that comes up, and you and I have talked about this as well, and I think it relates to the other cases as well, right? But it's this issue around colonialism and how the historical and institutional impacts of colonialism have influence on the issues that we're talking about on this webinar. I'm curious if you can maybe help us understand that a bit more. Like, why is it important to get an understanding of the colonial context in examining how social media platforms moderate, and let's use a case of Quechua, moderate Quechua user-generated content today?
Yeah, thank you very much. Ayanchu, Waikikuna, Panaikuna. Good morning, everybody, brothers and sisters. This is a great opportunity to having a South-South collaboration and dialogue. Understanding the colonial context is essential, I think, because it reveals the deeper power dynamics at play. Post-colonial countries like Peru and many others in South America still live under what we call the coloniality of power, that there is still some structures, hierarchies, and mindsets inherited from colonial times that persist today. In the colonial era, Spain appointed viceroys to govern entire regions. They didn't even know how or even understand how those regions work, imposing decisions from afar with little understanding of local realities. Today, big tech often replicates that model, I think. Decisions about moderating Quechua content are typically made by trust and safety teams who are entirely disconnected from the Andean context when we are speaking about Quechua. So yeah, I think in this case, they operate under the assumption these trust and safety teams and these things made by big tech operate under the assumption that Latin America is a singular uniform space, overlooking, in this case, its linguistical, cultural, and historical diversity. I think this means that the people deciding what stays online or get removed are often strangers to the communities they impact, and that the lack of proximity that can lead to harmful blind spots, delayed, or even the silencing of voices that are already marginalized. One example we can say about this is like nowadays August is a very important month in the Andean region of Peru, in the Andean region of Bolivia, in some cases in Chile, Argentina, and Ecuador too. Yeah, but what happens is that most of the moderation teams and the leadership of big tech are away from this cultural importance. I will say that there are people maybe from Argentina, not talking maybe people from Argentina or other places in Latin America. I will say even from Lima or even from Guayaquil or even from other cities that are not culturally similar to this. And this is because of the cultural context that we are in, that is a colonial past we have. So it relates also to the dynamic of power. Spanish in Latin America is the expression of power nowadays. So as long as Spanish is the expression of power, and other languages spoken here are not treated the same way and are not taken into account whenever big techs are doing moderation of content.
Yeah, this is very important, and I agree with the points you made. A lot of what you said resonated with some of the findings from our research from the Quechua case study, particularly this idea of the othering of or grouping of everyone within, say, South America as under one umbrella. But you see this in other regions too, and how the continent of people in Africa are treated, for example, as everyone being treated under one umbrella. So this idea then of not of being disconnected from the reality of, let's say, Quechua social media users and other social media users in the Andean region leads to problems. And one of our findings from our report, for example, highlighted that content moderation teams often lack Quechua speakers and analysts, and that the content policies used were essentially copied from English and Spanish and then applied to Quechua content. And that led to indecision, that led to delays, that led to poor moderation, it led to the non-removal of harmful content, etc. Right? So this is like what you're referring to. So then what do you think social media companies and other companies should do to better moderate? And I'm thinking specifically of Quechua or indigenous content. Like, what else should they be doing?
Yeah, I think that to truly improve moderation of Quechua and other indigenous language, I think tech companies need to go beyond surface level solution like hiring more Quechua speaking moderators. Investment is necessary, but it's investment alone, I think, isn't enough. What we really need is a shift in power and decision-making structures. Moderation teams shouldn't just include Quechua speakers at the lowest level, like workers or moderators themselves, but they should have Quechua speakers should have. I think they should have a real seat at the table in leadership, in policy design, and in development of community guidelines. At the very least, for matters related to moderation of indigenous content, people from those communities must be able to shape the rules, not just enforce them, because as we notice in the results and in the report, most of the cases is that the rules of moderation are only translation of the English one or the Spanish one to the others, to the other languages. So I think that is, as we are talking also about the legacy of coloniality, is also a shift in the conception of power. So in this case, Quechua speakers, indigenous language speakers need to have a seat in order to shape the rules and in order to be able to, about the rule, being able to enforce them with the relevance to the cultural and with the cultural relevance. Also, I think companies need to, big companies, big techs, need to recognize that translation is not a fix at all. Most of the cases, moderation is done by automation decisions made of translation. Quechua, like many indigenous language, is predominantly oral. Most translation systems, including AI, are built around written languages, but Quechua lack a single standardized writing system. So if platforms really rely only on text-based translation, they are already leaving behind a huge portion of the community. So I think that without rethinking who holds the power to define what's acceptable, and without adapting tools to the actual linguistic and cultural realities of indigenous peoples, content moderation will continue to reproduce the same exclusion to claims to fight. So yeah, it comes from the reshape of the structure, at least at the point of content moderation, and who makes the decisions, who makes the rules.
This is again a very important point around like how we introduce more influence or more community participation in the design of these policies, these content policies. And as you mentioned, starting at your first comments about the disconnect between many of these tech companies and the content that's generated by the users in question. So this is a gap. Also, I appreciate what you said about the limitations of some of these machine translation approaches. In fact, when we raise this option, or we raise this practice with LLM developers in the region, in the Andean region, they were surprised, given their knowledge of the limitations about using LLMs, for example, for translation from like Spanish to Quechua or other high resource languages to Quechua. So let me just end with one last question, and which is around the kind of relationship between Quechua and Spanish. Many people in the region will use both languages, right? They are bilingual, trilingual, and so on. But those that speak post in Quechua, our research highlighted another problem, which is that they face harassment abuse because they post in Quechua. And this is a function of historical racism and so on. I know Hiperderecho has done a lot of also examine this issue. So how can social media platforms pay more attention to and address harassment targeted at people who post in indigenous languages?
Yeah, as you say, like when we talk about harassment directed to people who post in Quechua or in other minority languages or indigenous languages, it's important to recognize that Quechua and these languages exist in a structurally unequal position compared to other dominant colonial languages like Spanish or English. So when platforms apply a so-called neutral approach or this global approach, treating all the languages the same way, what we are actually doing is reinforcing this systematic exclusion, because the playing field isn't level to begin with. Neutrality in an unequal system just sustains the inequality. So I think that what platforms should do instead is take affirmative actions in these cases. As long as Quechua and other languages are systematically excluded in exclusive position, there is need to take some affirmative actions. This means that I think that it needs to be some investment in order to make some dedicated teams, resources, and protection to Quechua-speaking creators. Maybe starting with the ones that have a large followers, like 1 million, 2 million followers, that they exist. So in this case, we can fix this kind of unfairness, and we can have these people more protected when they are exposed to online and violence and hate. Speaking Quechua in internet is not just communication, as is shown in the report. It's an act of resistance in this case, and like many acts of resistance, it's met with pushbacks, discriminations, mockery, exclusion, and not just from the state, but from the society at large. So I think that platforms have a responsibility to protect that resistance, not just to ensure digital safety, but to help guarantee the continuity of a people and a language that has been historically marginalized, and people that have the same right as everybody to use their language and not to be harassed because they use that language. So what will be desirable is more investment and to have, I don't know, special teams or special measures to people who create this great content in this language, because they see most of the time themselves as weight of resistance. So if you don't take action, if you don't take a position, you are just reinforcing the structural discrimination. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Dilmar. I see there is at least one person in the chat that's asking maybe for links from research from Hiperderecho, so you can feel free to respond to that. And what I'll do now is just hand it back to DeVan. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dhanaraj. We are going to actually go ahead and move to the Q&A segment. Dhanaraj will be really engaging with some of your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to him. I'm sure you're looking forward to this. Dhanaraj, over to you.
Thanks again. There have been many interesting and really thought-provoking questions in the Q&A. So thanks everyone for sharing both your comments and links and questions as well. I'm going to have to be a bit selective because our time is running short. So like I said, we appreciate all your questions, but I think we can only manage a few. So I want to start with one that came earlier on. And talked about the intersection between, using AI to support content moderation work. And this was during the conversation between Emna and Mona. And so more specifically, the question is, what if we had what if we use AI as a way of supporting content moderators, and more specifically, having content moderators moderate the work of AI? I think this requires some clarification about how these tools are used in content moderation processes and what the impacts can be from that. So maybe what I'll do first is ask Aliya if you can maybe just add us a quick comment or reaction to that, and then I might open it back up to either Emna or Mona, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for the question. There's so many questions that sort of point to this sort of dynamic that we're seeing from Silicon Valley that says, the psychic damage and psychological impacts of moderation are so great and we need to address this. And automated tools can help alleviate the burden on human moderators, and also just respond to the nature of the scale of the issue, which is the thousands, if not millions, of posts that are being posted every day. And I think what we're seeing, though, is that while these tools can be really beneficial and can be, as the question sort of asked, like supplementary to the people who are both doing the work, who in many cases need the jobs, right? Like these are jobs that are going to individuals who are looking for stable employment in rural areas in multiple countries, and also can help them sort of prioritize and are familiar with the context. We're, instead of seeing AI systems being used in that way, I think what we are seeing instead is sort of a redistribution of power back to Silicon Valley, saying, while we gave jobs to these individuals around the world, and we often contracted with business process outsourcing organizations that we have very little to do, we have sort of externalized the risk, externalized the cost. We don't know who these individuals are, but they're doing good work. We're seeing now a pullback of funds and investment there towards building in-house tools or towards using vendors in Silicon Valley, something I've been sort of colloquially referring to as like the global northification, further global northification of moderation. And instead of allowing, these individuals who have been doing this work to oversee the deployment of these tools, we're seeing them be given adjacent tasks such as data labeling, which again further requires the exposure to harmful content to label it. It requires people to sort of scan the outlines of an image that depicts a beheading. It entailed tagging or labeling what hate speech is. So again, further sort of harmful tasks. And, you know, again, I'm sort of speaking a little off the cuff because I think, you know, some of this work has really been incredibly documented by Mona, but some of this is so shrouded in NDAs and also shrouded in business speak and jargon but it ultimately sort of reflects this desire to not give up control or not give up ultimate decision or ultimate power, right? And I think the reason this question is really hard to answer is because shifting that power dynamic to allowing the moderators and allowing users to have more clarity on when these AI tools should be used and when they can be helpful but should be governed by people familiar with the local context is harder and is sort of the question that needs to be asked. But it's certainly the paradigm I think that would be more beneficial because these are individuals who are able to sort of oversee where a system might get something wrong.
Thanks, Aliya. So Mona, do you mind if I maybe just focus on Emna? Emna, if you have a quick reaction to that, maybe a minute or less, because we're running out of time. But please.
Yeah, I'll be very quick, and thank you. The problem with AI taking down content or doing the first layer is always the culture and sensitivity. And when we apply it in a language-specific context, we're losing a lot because of the data equity problem that is behind all of these issues. We don't have enough content that the AI would deal with and understand from. We don't have enough references. The dialects that we use on social media are not academic, are not available on open sources, not enough, at least. They are available in open source Wikipedia and other projects, but they are not enough. And so there is a huge data equity problem that will not resolve the content moderation issue.
That's very important. Thanks, Emna. We had a series of questions talking about civil society's role and how civil society can work with regulators, or maybe the problems of doing that or challenges of doing that, but also civil society might support more bottom-up, grassroots-led content moderation, development grassroots-led content moderation policies. So maybe I can quickly turn to both Dilmar and maybe Amrita, maybe if you have any quick reactions on that. And then Miriam, I'm gonna ask you a question. The last question I want to turn to before we close is on the fact-checking program. So yeah, Dilmar or Amrita, just curious if you have any thoughts on that, on civil society's role here.
I can go first and then maybe Dilmar can follow. Yeah, I think civil society has a critical role to play when it comes to advocacy. And I think civil society has been doing that work, but I think we see a little bit of sort of distinction between digital rights organizations and grassroots organizations that actually work with different constituencies who are users of these platforms, be it gender rights organizations, climate organizations, labor rights organizations. And I think there's some critical work that needs to be done for these civil society actors to also work with each other to sort of democratize the issues of content moderation. Some of the work that, for example, Point of View Digital Empowerment Foundation has been doing is to think about how can there be more participatory approaches to thinking about greater accountability on platforms. And I think that bridge needs to be sort of made where more civil society, because it's not a monolith again, right? Like, because we also see within digital rights organizations, there are often global north organizations, which are, for example, more represented in internet governance processes, or, when global south organizations are involved in these, often it's always this global south perspective. But, so how do we democratize some of these issues where there's greater equity even within who gets to participate in how these platforms are designed and how content is moderated?
Yeah, I think that I agree totally what Amrita said. In this case, I think that also South-South collaboration is important from some years on, we are having like this kind of spaces where Global South Organization are having some tables to work, some panels to discuss. So yeah, we need more of this. And also, I think that not just only civil society organizations that work on digital rights, because I don't know, in the Global South, mainly in Peru, most civil society organizations related to Indigenous people work on the defense of territory, they also work on environmental issues. So I think that and they also are affected by moderating content, because most of the content that they generate is not only or in Spanish or English or in the dominant language. So I think that the role of civil society organization is to enhance the collaboration South-South organizations, and also with other type of organizations, especially that are the ones that work most with the Indigenous people, to have this special focus on how is important to do a better moderation content, because it's not only about the digital rights or moderation content in abstract. It's also about environment, it's about the protection of territory, it's about self-determination. So yeah, I think we have to enhance this kind of collaboration. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both, and very important points, particularly on South-South collaboration. So the last question then that are, of the many that were important ones that were raised in the Q&A is around the end of Meta's fact-checking program. And Miriam, I wonder if I could put you on the spot, if that's okay, but also give you the last word on your thoughts and the implications of that, the closure of that program for languages such as Swahili and other critical important languages in the Global South.
Yeah, thanks, Dhanaraj. So without assuming that everyone knows what happened, so for context, you remember beginning of this year, January 2025, Mark Zuckerberg announced that they are shutting down or closing their third-party fact-checking for Instagram, Facebook, Threads, the parent company, Meta. And the reasoning behind this was, fact-checking was becoming too restrictive, and it was creating a lot of restrictions, and in the spirit of freedom of expression, then they pulled down, or they were against the fact-checking policy. But obviously, it depends on whether or not you want to be political about it, because this came during the Trump era, and of course, a lot of them were trying to please the new regime. This is problematic for a number of reasons. For sure, I am not for eliminating fact-checking. Even with the content moderation as we had it, it was problematic. Now this is another layer, completely eliminating fact-checkers. And I say this because, and particularly against what they're now calling community notes. And community notes have been used for different platforms before. It is not an entirely new concept. I know Wikimedia does it. A few others have done it as well. But specifically for social media, you want fact-checking mechanisms or content moderation mechanisms that are swift and fast to counter misinformation as it comes. Now, for fact-checking, it would take quite a long time for it to happen. So that's why I'm particularly against it. So with this program scrapped, of course, we're seeing a surge in terms of misinformation, disinformation, partisan bias, and it's just becoming an extremely unsafe and volatile space on the digital era. So that's what I would say in terms of ending fact checking. But as my closing remarks, I would say, given this is a conversation around the global majority, and we are the global majority for a reason. We have the brains, we have the numbers, and in fact, I saw a study released last week that Kenyans are the most users of ChatGPT, and previous years, even this year, Kenyans are top users of social media platforms across the continent. And if you look at a few other countries that come after that, most of them are global majority. We have Brazil, we have Nigeria, So we have the numbers. In fact, it is our money that is making these companies operate and prosper. So I think it's a challenge to our developers, our experts, our people in academia, that we need to develop platforms that work for us, by us, instead of constantly being the end user all the time. And in case there are people from big tech companies that have joined this specific call, I think it's a call to all of you to ensure that better in terms of content moderation. When you are excluding certain what we're calling low resource languages, it's not just a matter of access or taking down content. It's largely a digital exclusion act. So we're calling for better policies, we're calling for localized policies, we're calling for at least resourcing to understand different cultures and contexts, because that ultimately matters. But yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Miriam. As well said, centering global majority voices in content moderation, design, and policy is very important. Thank you for that. So thank you all for your reactions. And I know we went over time, so apologies for that. DeVan, I'm going to hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was just closing us out. Thank you so much to our external speakers, Miriam, Emna, Amrita, Dilmar, and to Mona, who's actually external now, and to our advisory committee, FF Abrugi, Wanjiru Sambuli, Jillian York, and Juan Carlos. We'll make sure to include a note about who they are in our post email to all of you. And thank you for joining. Thank you for the CDT teams who made this happen. Thanks Jamal and Adinawa, and thank you to our funders, the ISOC Foundation. There are links to all of our partners' work online in the chat, so please access that. And with that, I will go ahead and close us out.
Thank you.